section about language classification, or at least the typological part, and just get down to genetic. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's classifying languages according to relationship, okay, like genetic relationship, father to child or mother to child, brother and sister languages, so that we refer to languages that derive from a common ancestor as sister languages. They contain cognate words, etc. That is, words that are related to other words in other languages. And you're going to see in the text, at least, which goes into a great bit more detail, gives you a lot of cognate words between Germanic and several of the other Indo-European languages. So our focus in here is on Indo-European because it is the ultimate parent language of modern English, okay, or of the Germanic languages. And you've got a map here, which I'll blow up a bit, which shows you the distribution of languages by language family kind of around the world. And you see Indo-European, and notice Indo-European in terms of the European and Asian continents stretches from Spain and the UK, Norway and Denmark, through all of Europe, with one little exception right there in that crosshair, okay, and then all the way over to China. Okay, we'll talk about where or why this is included. Comes down over here into India, okay, which, notice, this includes Persia or Iran. It does not include modern-day Iraq, which is right in there. This is all Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Qatar and everything. But all of this, that's Iran right there, all the way just about to over there, down to southern India, okay, United States, portions of Canada, South, Alaska, North and South America, except for the interior jungle of South America. Notice what is not included in here, or what this chart doesn't show. It doesn't really show much Native American. It's not big enough to do that. But in terms of dispersal, it's the widest spread of all the major language groups. And these are the other major language groups. Afro-Asiatic, pretty much in this area. Can't read that from over here. Nilo-Saharan, down here, even though the Sahara is around there. Niger-Congo, pretty much sub-equatorial Africa. Caucasian, I'm partially colorblind, so I can't tell which difference that is. Uralic and Altaic, okay. This is Siberia, largely Mongolia, okay. And that little spot right there, is actually, I'm surprised it's not differentiated. That's usually, well, I know why it is. That spot and that are usually combined into a group called Finno-Ugric, Finno-Ugric. And the Ugric is that right there, and it's Hungarian. Hungary, which sits kind of right smack in the middle of Central Eastern Europe, is not Indo-European at all. All these other languages around it are Indo-European. And Finnish, Sami, is not Indo-European at all. Okay? This is one of the big questions. Where did this come from? Because, I mean, it's grouped with these two larger, but it's not Altaic, and it's not really Uralic, which is the language east of the Ural Mountains, which are right in here. This is the Ural Sea, or the Aral Sea. Let me shrink that back down. So, I mean, it's a pretty good spread, largely because of colonization and stuff like that. So, where does the term Indo-European come from? Sir William Jones was a judge serving in India who was a polymath of sorts. The guy knew an awful lot about an awful lot. And he was an amateur philologist. Okay? And by that I mean he wasn't employed as a philologist. Again, he was a judge serving the crown in Africa. And he wrote an article that was delivered and that was published in the Journal of the Asiatic Society in 1786. On your electronic notes, if you click that link, it should take you to it. And what you have there is the Linguistics Research Center, and it takes you to this book, A Reader in 19th Century Historical European Linguistics, which begins with Sir William Jones's address. Okay, it's the first thing in the book, and you can see what else is in the book by going to the table of contents, which are right there. These are all major texts in historical linguistics. Okay, Rasmus Rask, about the source of the Old Northern or Icelandic language. We're going to talk about Rask, refer to him briefly in a moment. And Franz Bopp, Jacob Grimm, all these other guys. Okay, let's go back over here. This is what he says. The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, meaning richer, it's much more developed, more exquisitely refined than either. And that is saying a lot, because ancient Greek and Latin are very refined. They have multiple cases in terms of nouns, how the nouns are used, things like that. Yet buried to both of them a stronger affinity both in the roots of verbs and in the forms of grammar than could possibly have been produced by accident. Meaning, there's some kind of relationship among them that can't just be an accident. He's saying they must be related. So strong indeed that no philologer, we would say philologist, could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. Now, the idea of a common source behind languages was nothing new. Because, after all, what biblical story gives the reason for the multiplicity of languages? The Tower of Babel. So you had quote-unquote scholars would argue Hebrew is the best language. I mean, in the 15th century and 16th century, you see this happen. Hebrew is the best language. Why? Because it is closest to the original language spoken by Adam and Eve. Utter nonsense. I mean, just absolute, utter nonsense. Okay? But that's what was thought. So, it's not by accident, he says. They spring from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. There is a similar reason, though not quite so forcible, for supposing that both the Gothic and the Celtic, though blended with a very different idiom, kind of a usage, had the same origin with the Sanskrit. And the Old Persian might be added to the same family. So what has he just done? He's just united Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Gothic, Celtic, and Persian. 7 languages that are widely different and that exist in widely different places. Go back up to the map for a moment, Sanskrit, largely over here in India, and over here in India. Persian, over here in Iran. Gothic, north of the Balkans, north of the river Danube. Okay. Celtic, over here in Ireland for the most part, as well as parts of Scotland and Wales and Brittany. Greek in the Greek Isles predominantly. In Latin, pretty much only in Italy, except for its derivatives. Okay. French, Portuguese, Romany, Italian, etc. Okay. So, and the Old Persian might be added to the same family if this were the place for discussing any question concerning the antiquities of Persia. Almost sounds like we don't want to talk about Persian because it's going to anger some people. Okay? This is the first time this idea is propounded, that all of these languages spring from a common source. All right? So, the online documents is close to that page that we were at before. It actually is there. No, close that tab. I can't read that from over here. It would be probably in here. Okay. So if you go to the linguistic, whatever that page was called, Linguistic Research Center, you'll find those online documents there. Three main people in terms of Indo-European historical linguistics from the early 19th century to be aware of. Jacob Grimm, brother of Wilhelm, the two of them together were the ones who went around Germany collecting oral folk tales, published as Grimm's Fairy Tales. That's what Grimm did kind of on the side, when he wasn't being a major Germanic kind of linguist. He wrote a book in 1822, second edition 1822, first edition I think was 1818, the mid-18 teens, I believe, called Deutsche Grammatik, or Teutonic Grammar, or German Grammar, if you want. Okay? This emphasizes phonology, the sounds of the language. And what he's doing there is he's comparing all the branches of Germanic. And he has a section in there where he compares the sounds of Germanic with the sounds of the other Indo-European languages. Okay? Latin, Greek, Italic, Sanskrit, etc. Bear in mind, Jones writes this, 36 years before Grimm's second edition. Rasmus Rask, who's a Dane, also writes a book. It's included in that, the link I took you to, or part of it is included in that link I took you to. He has a particular influence on Grimm, particularly Grimm's Law. He's interested in morphology as well as phonology. Morphology, remember, the smallest meaningful units in a language, like the bases of words, and then their inflections. Okay? Franz Bopp was also primarily interested in morphology. He wrote a book called Vergleichende Grammatik, or Comparative Grammar. Now, Grimm doesn't call his comparative. Bopp does. Bopp is particularly looking at this language, pretty much all the Indo-European languages, or many of them, and looking at them comparatively in terms of grammar and morphology. How do words look similar or dissimilar? Okay, in all these languages. Those are three main texts. Term Indo-European. Early on, the more preferred term was Indo-Germanic or Aryan. You can kind of get an idea why Aryan fell out of favor. It's because of Hitler. Aryan, all it really means is kind of the noble ones. And it's interesting because you still have people today that use that term. In fact, there's a nation, or two actually, that have that as part of their name. Iran comes from Aryan, and Eire, E-I-R-E. You could put a land on the end of it. Ireland has the same root meaning. Another way it's been understood is that the Aryan term kind of implies the us-them mentality. The we are the Aryans. Everybody else is kind of, the other, let's call it. It was called Indo-Germanic somewhat early on because notice what's being done there. You're linking kind of the two farthest locales, okay, of the language, or in Indo-European. Indo, India, Germanic, the farthest reach. Okay? The term Indo-European was coined by Thomas Young. Yeah, the same guy who helped Champollion decipher the Rosetta Stone in 1813. Now here's where I think Indo-European gets really interesting. Where did they originally come from? That is, the Indo-Europeans. We have to back up here for a moment. When we talk about Indo-Europeans, one, we're talking about a linguistic group. We're not talking about a nationality. Okay? So when we talk about the Indo-Europeans or the Proto-Indo-Europeans, we're talking about a people who spoke a language that is called Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European. They did not refer to themselves in that way, in any way. Okay? We have no written material left behind by this group. All we have is archaeological information and the written texts and such that were left behind by their successors. That is, by all the groups that they eventually split off into, such as the Germanic peoples, the Celtic peoples, the Greek peoples, the Italic peoples, the Indian peoples, the Persian peoples, the Baltic peoples, the Slavic peoples. Okay? All those groups are Indo-European. We're all, in other words, we're all related. So, when the United States and Iran rattle their sabers at each other, it's like cousins rattling their sabers at each other. When the United States and Putin rattle their sabers, it's because we, up here, notwithstanding 5,000 years of history, there is some shared ways of perceiving the world up here that we haven't gotten rid of. And I don't mean gotten rid of in the sense that we're trying to. I mean in the sense that it hasn't been drained from our consciousness. There are ways that we look at the world. There are ways we perceive things that are Indo-European that no other linguistic group has. This is really important to get in your mind. So, where did they come from? Well, one of the things Indo-European scholars did was to try to determine where they came from was, for one example, they looked to the languages that were left behind. And you start looking at cognates. That is, you start looking at words that exist in all the languages that are related. Okay, words that are related to each other. Because, for example, in Germanic, you've got a bunch of words that have no cognates in the other Indo-European languages. Your book mentions several of them. Like drink. Drink. It's a native Germanic term that Avestan and Persian and Celtic, they don't share a cognate. Does that mean they didn't drink? No. It means they don't have a word that is related to our word drink. They had some other word. Okay? So, what do you see? If you read your chapter in here, where they talk about the homeland. Plant and animal names are important clues. I've given you some there. Words for honey, beech tree, snow, sea. Sea. Why? Because there is no cognate for sea or ocean in the Indo-European languages. That means that probably means that the original group that spread was not near an ocean or sea. Okay? Page 56 in your book. The existence of cognates denoting trees, for example, that grow in temperate climates. Alder, apple, ash, aspen, beech, birch, elm, hazel, linden, oak, willow, yew. They all have words for these trees that are related. So that means wherever those people lived, they probably had those trees in that area. Similarly, there is an absence of words for trees like olive, cypress, and palm, which probably indicates they weren't Mediterranean in origin. They didn't live anywhere where you would see palm trees or cypress trees. Okay? What else? Cognates for wolf, bear, lox. Lox mean L-O-X meaning salmon. Okay? Indicate a possible location. Well, what's the location? Yeah, we'll get to the Kurgan hypothesis in a minute. There's really three contending theories. Okay, I was surprised. I was rereading this today. This is 2004. Yeah, I was really surprised when rereading this today how strongly this text comes out in favor of Maria Gimbutas's theory. Okay, who's down there at the bottom of that list. Because the Colin Renfrew theory and the Gamkrelidze and Ivanov theories are still both well respected. The Gamkrelidze and Ivanov theory not as much as the Colin Renfrew, but Renfrew's out of Anatolia theory is a major contender. Let me back up for a minute. North Central Europe, okay, is one area between the Vistula and Elbe rivers. Very few people hold that. The guy who held it was a German. Where is that? Right smack in the middle of Germany. That fits into this Indo-Germanic, okay, idea. After thema, there are three major theories. Maria Gimbutas is probably the foremost. She taught at UCLA for, 40 years, 45 years. She died, I don't remember, 10 years or so ago. When I was a doctoral student in English, I took a course outside English. I took a couple, actually. I took a couple years of Latin, and then I took a course on Foundations of Indo-European Thought and Culture by an anthropologist. Guy was amazing. He could speak something like 15 different languages. His parents were deaf mute. Okay.
So he could speak sign language too? Or,
oh, yeah. And he would tell stories, because he'd go off in the summers and work on digs in Yugoslavia, Iran, Iraq, etc. He got kidnapped. He was in Afghanistan sometime in the 80s. He got kidnapped by some fighters. This was during, Afghanistan in Soviet Union's war. He got kidnapped by some fighters. They thought he was an American spy, etc. And he essentially had to convince them that he wasn't. And so he just started talking to them in Pashtun, first of all. And he's scraggly beard and all this kind of stuff. He was telling them about their heritage because he knew their culture. He knew their country inside and out. They could tell this guy isn't a CIA plant. Okay? Even though at the time, Afghanistan wanted CIA plants because the CIA was opposing, Russia and stuff. He brought into class one day a shoebox of items from a dig he had done. Where was this? Somewhere, I think it was in the Caucasus or in one of the areas that might be, Indo-European homeland. And he has a shoebox and he passes it around. And the shoebox has in it pieces of glass and figurines and these stones with proto-writing on it that date from 7000 BC. And he's just passing them around. I'm like, are you crazy? Because it's amazing stuff.
Where did he get that stuff?
From a dig he had participated in.
Oh, okay.
an archaeological date. Maria Gimbutas was his dissertation director. So I kind of had an inside track. He was using as a textbook for the class a book he was writing. So he would bring in Xeroxes every week, ask questions, make revisions. Just an amazing class. But these three theories, Maria Gimbutas first proposed her theory in 1956. Okay, hers is called kind of the Kurgan Hypothesis. Kurgans are burial mounds. Okay, they're not like you put somebody in the ground and you put like a 5-foot mound of dirt. No, these are like 30, 50, 70 feet tall mounds of dirt. Huge mounds. Okay, she would place the Indo-European homeland northwest of the Caucasus Mountains and north of the Caspian Sea. So come down here for a moment. Blow this up a little bit. Okay. Caucasus Mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And so she puts it essentially right in this area, which is the southern steppes of Russia. Okay. It is fairly temperate. Notice where it is, latitudinally. It's a little bit south of England. It's like Paris, France. Okay. It's not way up here in northern Germany, so it's not super cold, but it's not near an ocean. It's not near a sea. All those kinds of trees we talked about are readily available. All the animals that we talked about are readily available there. Okay? Go back up here for a moment. This identifies the peoples of the Kurgan cultures of 5000 BC. Okay? Now, one of the things about them is we know that these people, the Kurgan people, we know that they spread. Because you can see it, you can watch as this area that is densely populated with Kurgans, the Kurgans start to move. That is, you start to see Kurgans spread further and further out. So this is where she suggests, okay, the homeland was at the beginning. We'll talk about the Indo-European ideology next week, I think. We won't get into that tonight, because that's what gets really interesting. She thinks migrations began probably around 4,000 to 3,000 BC. Okay? So 6,000 to 5,000 years ago. And it started here. This then shows, blow that up a little bit more. This then shows where they start to break off to. Okay, homelands in this area, and it starts, one group starts to move up here towards the north. Okay, this is what's called the corded ware culture. These people, who later become Germanic tribes, they're called the corded ware because they would make pottery, and they would decorate the pottery with cords, like you have a little thin, like a 1/4 inch rope. And while the pottery was still wet, they would wrap the pottery with the cord. And then remove the cord, and it leaves that imprint. So on the basis of that alone, they're called the corded ware culture. Okay? Notice, here in this western branch, you start to see stock breeding cultures. Okay? We know the Kurgan peoples had the wheel, they had horses, they had wagons. Originally, they were farmers. But then for some reason, they start becoming nomadic. I've got a book in my office by one of the foremost Indo-European scholars in the world called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, or The Horse, the Wheel, and Culture. His last name's Robertson. Some of my students got it for me a couple of years ago after don't remember what class they were taking. Old English. And what Robertson argues, and shows pretty much, is that it's from the Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans are probably the ones who invent the wheel. Because what happens once you invent a wheel? It makes it really easy to pack up and move. Because if you don't have a wheel, what are you doing? You're carrying it. Or a pack horse is carrying it. Okay? So it starts here, and then starts to move north there, starts to move western here, starts to move southern here. Okay? You have a little group starting to come over here. The Aryan branch starts coming over here. That's going to become the Iranian. Okay, it's making its way down here. Sorry. The Baltic branch is coming down into this area right around what is today called the Baltics. This little group is kind of awkward. We don't know exactly when it spreads out, but it's part of, notice that color, okay? Keep going down a little bit. This is approximately 2500 to 1800 BC. And you start to see a lot more activity, let's say. Okay, now notice where the Iranian group is. These are the people that will develop into Iranian speakers, what's called Avestan and Persian, primarily. They're still way up here in what is today Russia, or Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. Because Iran is down here. They haven't yet made their way down through the Hindu Kush Mountains. Okay? The Indo-Aryans are still here. The Tocharian group is here, which we'll talk about them probably next week. They are one of the most interesting of the Indo-European groups because they don't fit. The Tocharians, okay, they all start up here. The Tocharians end up way over here in Mongolia. And we have no idea why or how. And their language is closer to Greek and Italic and German than it is to the other Eastern branches. Okay? The Balto-Slavic branches are here. Okay, notice Germany is over here. The area of this is modern day like Poland and Ukraine. Okay, notice they haven't gone up here. What is all this? Finno-Ugric. Okay, Finnish, Sami language over here. Altaic languages, the native Siberian, in other words, over here. The Germanic languages have already moved into southern Sweden, Denmark, what is modern day Germany. Hittite. Okay. It had been thought that the Hittites of the Old Testament were a made-up people, that they weren't real, that was part of the mythology inherent in the Old Testament. And then in early 20th century, I want to say like 1915, 1920, in a archaeological dig in modern-day Turkey, this area in here, big old library was discovered in cuneiform. And interestingly enough, that library proved the existence of the Hittites. For one reason, because it was written in Hittite. Okay? And it showed that Hittite is the earliest attested form of Indo-European that's around. That is, the Hittite language is the closest, probably, to the original. It had been thought, oh, it's Sanskrit. Sanskrit's the closest. Hittite preserves, we'll talk about this a little bit next week, Hittite preserves a sound, one sound, that it's thought Indo-European had to have. Hittite is the only one of the languages that shows it in a surviving written text. Okay? None of the others have it. And interestingly enough, one scholar posited that if Hittite existed, it would have that sound. He posited the Indo-European had to have that sound without having any evidence from any of the surviving languages. But on the basis of comparison of sounds, he said, this sound has got to exist back there. Okay? The guy who said that, Ferdinand de Saussure, who is responsible, I shouldn't say that, upon whose work Deconstruction was created, the literary critical technique or theory of deconstruction. Okay, so that's showing 2500, 1800 BC. The next theory, Colin Renfrew, shrink that down some. Colin Renfrew proposed his theory in 1987. Notice 30 years after Murray Gimbutas. And I was looking in my office for Renfrew's book, and I can't find it. And I'm really hoping I didn't loan it to somebody who stole it. Back up. Renfrew suggests that the Indo-European homeland is in eastern Anatolia. Now, this whole land here is called Anatolia. He suggests it's in like this area, right? In modern-day Turkey, among farmers. And he says the migrations began for a simple pastoral reason. The population got overcrowded. There wasn't enough room to farm in the land. So people began moving out. The Kurgan hypothesis isn't as peaceful. Because what it suggests, and what Indo-European ideology suggests, is that the Indo-Europeans were initially farmers, but then they became nomadic raiders and pillagers and plunderers. They would move into somebody else's territory and take it from them. One of the reasons that is thought is because of the stories that survive in all the surviving Indo-European languages. Among the oldest stories that there are cognate versions of in all the languages, cattle raiding is a huge theme. Okay? Where people are moving into or stealing their neighbors' cattle, etc., and then having to defend it. So warfare becomes a major component of that. So Renfrew says Anatolia, and here's what happens. You see them start to break off just in a variety of directions. So southeast of Anatolia, what do you get? That's going to be the Persians and the Indian languages. Northwest, okay, you're going to move up into the southern steppes of Russia, the Slavic languages. Up this way, Baltic languages and the Germanic languages. Little problem with that, because the Baltic languages and the Slavic languages are closely related. A not so little problem with that is that the Germanic languages and the Balto-Slavic languages also have one very interesting connection that's not found in any of the other Indo-European languages. They all form what's called the dative plural. And you'll see this when we get to the Old English period. They all form what's called the dative plural with the UM ending. The Germanic languages and the Balto-Slavic languages. Okay? We'll talk about that more later, but that's something that links them. The Italic languages down in here, the Greek languages over here. Okay? Italic and Celtic are probably closely related because they share many similarities. Baltic and Slavic are very closely related. So when this original group began to split up, probably you had one large group that would become Baltic and Slavic that gradually separated, and maybe along with that Germanic, and maybe Germanic separated first. We're not sure. We're not sure the order of any of these divisions. Okay? Some people say Germanic was the last group to break off, because it has several unique characteristics. Some people say Germanic was the first group to break off. And the reason it has those unique characteristics is because all the other languages continue changing simultaneously together. And Germanic obviously had already broken off, so it couldn't have those changes. Shrink back down. And then the third idea, proposed by a couple of Russians, is the Armenian Hypothesis. Do I not have a map for that? Yeah, here it is. They place the homeland just south of the Caucasus Mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas. Now, remember where Gimbutas put it. North of the Caucasus Mountains. It's from Caucasus, by the way, that we get the word Caucasian. Okay? This suggests the first migration was to the southeast and then gradually spun counterclockwise. So it starts like this. And it's here. Okay, remember Gimbutas. Come on, wake up. Gimbutas puts the homeland up in this area. Okay. Renfrew puts it here. Gamkrelidze and Ivanov put it down here in Armenia. And they say it starts by people moving off this direction. So the Iranians, the Indians, the Tocharians all break off first. And then the Baltic Slavic peoples, the Germanic peoples, etc. come off this way. The Greek peoples come off this way. The reason this is kind of odd was it would mean that, for example, Italic comes up this way, and then they come down into Italy, and the Celts come off over here. And it would put the Celtic and Italic and Balto-Slavic and Germanic groups together for a fairly long time, which kind of common sense would say then you would expect there to be more commonality between those five major groups than there is. Okay. As I said earlier, as your book suggests, most scholars today take the Kurgan hypothesis, or a somewhat modified form of it, as being the closest to probably what really happened. Okay? And let's stop there. We'll get more into comparative linguistics and the division between all the language groups next week. Questions? I mean, if anything tonight was interesting to you, I can suggest sources for the Homeland theory. It'll probably be more interesting. If anything tonight was interesting, your interest might get even more piqued next week as we talk a little bit about ideology. Right? And get into the Germanic branches specifically. All right, we'll stop there.